Hi everyone, and welcome back in my studio. Today in this video I'm going to show you how to take measurements of a sculpture of which you would like to make a copy in stone. And I'm going to show you how to take those measurements with the assistance here of my plaster cast of the Man from Delos. The original is a Greek sculpture of about 100 BC, and it is today found in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens. By the way, if you're interested in having your own plaster copy of this sculpture, leave me a message here below or send me an email. You can find my address at my website. I'll put the link in the description here below, or send me a DM on my Instagram, because I have the mold of this sculpture and I can always make extra casts and ship them to you. So if you're interested, get in touch and we'll discuss the details. But now let's get to measuring this head. So when taking measurements of a sculpture that you would like to carve in stone, it's very important to get the exact measurements. Because you see, stone is sold by weight. And if you don't get the right measurements, and let's say for safety reasons you get them slightly larger, so let's say a couple of centimeters extra on each side, that might add up in weight, which will result in a much more expensive piece. Not to mention the extra amount of hours that you'll need to put in to remove that extra unnecessary material. So it's important to get the exact right measurements. Also, you don't want to be confronted with the surprise to have ordered a smaller piece than the actual sculpture. So it's a fairly simple method. We have 3 dimensions. We have the width, the depth, and the height. In this video, I'm going to talk only about the width and the depth, because the height has some tricky aspects that I would like to address properly in a separate video. So the tools that we need for measuring a head like this, or for that matter, any sculpture that had somehow the similar proportions, are just a pencil and a square like this one. Preferably a square that can stand by itself. Not the ones that are shaky, but this one has a platform at the bottom, so you can literally place it like this and it will stand by itself. I would also advise you to place your sculpture on a clean, flat surface. It could be a piece of paper, it could be another stone. I'm having here some wood, and preferably with a light surface, because we're going to put down the exterior lines of the piece onto the surface. Okay, without further ado, let's see how to approach this process. So what we need to measure is the sides of the sculpture, the width of the sculpture, and then I'll turn it over and show you how to measure the depth of the sculpture. Let's start with the sides. It's very simple. So if you have a square like this that is able to stand by itself, you just place it near the sculpture, you see, and then you approach the sculpture and you just make sure to touch the most projecting part of the sculpture. So in this case, you see that the square here, it's touching the ear. There we go. Just touched the top of the ear. And now we can follow that line, which is then projecting down here on the wood. And then you just put a mark here where that line ends, so down here. So this point here that we have drawn on the board is the projection of the most outward point of the sculpture. And what you then do is strike a straight line on the board or the piece of paper that you have or the stone. And this is why it needs to be light, because you would want to see that line later on. So I'm using now the same square, and you just strike that line over the board. And if you want to be 100% sure that that line doesn't go within the sculpture, you can place the square here in front of the sculpture and then move it along the line and see that it doesn't touch anything else than the sculpture beside the tip of the ear. So we're just moving that square and we see that we are not touching the sculpture except for this point here. And then if I go back following that line, I'm safe. If you're measuring the outside of a sculpture with a metal square like this one, make sure that when marking down the line, you put a line on the right side of the square. So the square has a thickness. Don't mark this side of the square because this is not touching the statue. The part that is touching the statue is the inside of the square. So make sure to mark that line. And don't lose your focus because you might by mistake mark either this line or this line as well, which are not indicative of the outside of the sculpture. So really focus, concentrate on which one of those lines you should mark. And for this reason, it is sometimes easier to place the square like this against the sculpture, because then you will be able to mark exactly where the square reaches the board down here. One thing that I forgot to mention is that before you do this, you should draw the basis of the sculpture onto the wood piece in this case, because if it moves, then you're always able to place it back exactly in the same position. So I'm going to draw this circle here. So let's now move to the other side and repeat exactly the same process. So we are placing the square here to the side and the most projecting part is somewhere here. So let's then get closer to it and see when we touch the sculpture. That's it. That's the most projecting part of the sculpture. And then I'm going to mark that point where it touches the board. You can also do it in this way if you want. So you could place the square like this so that you can actually see that line going down, and then you touch the sculpture over there. This is just as a double check, and now you can clearly see how here the square functions almost as a plumb line. By the way, I mentioned before that this is a fairly easy, simple sculpture in sense of structure and also in size. Luckily, the square is big enough to reach this height, but sometimes you'll be confronted with more difficult situations. For example, let's say that you're doing a life-size sculpture of a human figure and the model is holding his or her hand out. How would you measure that if you don't have a very long square? Then you will need to use the plumb line. So in this case, let's say that the model is standing like this, you would need to put a plumb line here and then pull it all the way down to the ground and mark that point. But we don't need that in this case, so this is sufficient. And then I'm just going to mark that point here, down there, and then pull it through on the board. And then you must check to be 100% sure, because again, this is a fairly simple sculpture, but let's say that you're doing an abstract sculpture. It might be sometimes difficult to localize the most projecting point. So by doing this double check, it would be easy to see if you're within the sculpture or not. So just place the square on the line and then pull it through. Keep staying on the line, and you see that I'm touching the sculpture here exactly at the point where the square meets the hair, and if I pull it back, it doesn't touch the sculpture anymore. So we're safe on that side. Okay, so now we have two lines on the sides. This is the width of the sculpture. You can measure that width if you want for curiosity, but I'm going to delay that and I'm going now to measure the depth of the sculpture. So I'm just going to turn the piece so that you can see what is happening. Of course, you don't need to do this. This is just for the camera. So you see, this is how the sculpture looks like from the profile. And it's very clear that the most projecting point is the nose and somewhere here in the hair. So again, same thing. Let's take the square and place it slowly, push it towards the hair, and be sure to stand at a straight angle with the previous direction, because of course, depending from where you're standing with respect to the sculpture, you're going to see a different projecting point. For example, if I'm standing here, from this view, this is the most projecting point because this is the profile that I'm seeing. So it's important to stay exactly here and then push the square slowly, and you see that we are touching this part of the hair here. So again, follow that line and mark it down. If you want to be sure, also place the square like this. Sometimes it gives a different result. I never understood why, but just that's probably has to do with the precision with which you mark the line on the board. So let's see. That is the most projecting point. And indeed, it's exactly the same line that we have just drawn here. So again, take the square, place it down, then pull that line. I would also advise you to pull the line throughout the whole board, because in a minute you will see we will end up with a square here. And once you have your stone, you would need to put it on top of this drawing so that you can check if the drawing fits within the stone or not. So keep the drawing, don't throw it away. It will be very helpful later on. So that's the line that we have drawn here. Let's go to the front. And this is the tip of the nose that goes all the way down until here. Be careful, be very precise, because as you know, the pencil has a width. The tip of the pencil has a width, usually it's a couple of millimeters wider than the actual point. So bear that in mind when you're drawing the line. So either pull the square back by a couple of millimeters, or once you measure the measurements, add a couple of millimeters just to be safe. So that's the line of the nose. Place the square here and pull that line through. So I now ended up with a rectangle on the board, and those are the measurements of this sculpture. And if you take a meter, then we can see that the sculpture is, in this case, 22 centimeters wide and 27 centimeters deep. Just to be sure, let's check from the other side. So here it's 27 centimeters deep and exactly 22 centimeters wide. So these are already two measurements of the block that you will need to order. Just to be safe, just to be sure, it would be good to add half a centimeter to it, maybe a centimeter or half an inch, and then you'll be completely safe. Okay, this was it for today's video. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to measure the height. That is a bit more complicated. Well, not really, but I need to address a few things in specific, so I would like to do that in a separate video. But before you go away, I just wanted to tell you that I have started some online courses, and if you're interested, you can go and check them out on the website that I have created for them. It's the Sculpture Channel, so at www.sculpturechannel.com. I'll put the link in the description down below. I have a course about letter carving. Some other courses are coming up about carving little Baroque heads or some grotesque masks, flower ornament, stone masonry. If you're interested, go check them out. And in the meantime, if you have any comments, questions, remarks of what I discussed today, leave them in the comments down here below. As always, I'm Athar, and I'll see you next time.